In the heart of Kentucky's rolling hills, where the mid-19th century sun scorched the earth and the weight of slavery crushed the human spirit, a single scream shattered the stillness of a quiet night. That scream marked a moment that would echo through history, a moment when Henry Johnson, an enslaved black man, struck back against years of relentless humiliation. Born into chains, Henry's life was defined not by dreams or freedom, but by the lash of the whip and the cruel laughter of a white neighbor who tormented him for sport. This neighbor, a man with no claim over Henry but an insatiable need to degrade, mocked him, beat him, and spat on his dignity for years. Yet, on that fateful night, Henry's silence broke. With an axe in hand, he ended the laughter that had haunted him, turning a lifetime of pain into a defiant act of resistance. This is not just a story of violence. It's a raw, unflinching look at a man pushed beyond endurance. A man who dared to reclaim his humanity in a world that denied it. Join us as we unravel Henry Johnson's heart-wrenching tale of survival, rage, and rebellion. In the sweltering fields of Kentucky, where the sun beat down on endless rows of cotton and the air carried the weight of unspoken suffering, Henry Johnson's life began under the shadow of slavery. Born in the early 19th century, Henry entered a world that branded him as property before he could even speak his own name. His earliest memories weren't of carefree days or childish adventures, but of the biting chill of winter slicing through a threadbare shirt, his small hands blistered from hauling buckets of water or picking cotton until his fingers bled. Childhood, for Henry, was no gentle season. It was a relentless cycle of labor that began before dawn and ended long after dusk. The fields demanded his body, and the system demanded his silence. Hunger was his constant companion, gnawing at his stomach as he lay on a rough pallet each night, the ache of exhaustion his only lullaby. In this brutal world, there was no room for dreams, only the grinding reality of survival in a land that saw him as less than human. Henry's family, like so many others bound by the chains of slavery, was a fragile thread in a tapestry constantly torn apart. He was just a boy, perhaps no older than 10, when he watched his mother's face disappear into the chaos of an auction block. Her eyes, a mix of terror and resignation, haunted him long after she was gone, sold to a distant plantation as if she were no more than livestock. His brothers and sisters, too, were scattered like leaves in a storm, their names and faces fading into the cruel ledger of human commerce. Henry learned early that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every bond he formed carried the risk of being severed in a single, heart-wrenching moment. Grief, in this world, was not a private sorrow but a public spectacle, played out before the cold eyes of overseers and bidders. The lesson was seared into his young heart. Attachments were dangerous, and survival meant hardening himself against the pain of loss. Yet, even as a child, Henry carried something within him that refused to break, a quiet spark of defiance that flickered beneath the weight of his suffering. As he grew, the demands of the plantation only intensified. Henry's days were measured by the rhythm of labor: cotton under the blistering summer sun, wood chopped in the crisp autumn air, fields cleared even as winter's frost hardened the ground beneath his bare feet. His shoulders broadened, his hands grew callous, but the invisible burdens he carried were far heavier than any load of timber or cotton. Every command barked by an overseer, every lash of the whip that stung his back, carved deeper grooves into his memory. The voices that ordered him around, often younger than he was, spoke with a casual cruelty that stripped away his dignity. To those who claimed ownership, Henry was nothing more than a tool, a pair of hands and a strong back to be worked until they broke. They saw his bowed head and swift obedience as proof of a tamed spirit, but they were wrong. Behind the mask of compliance, Henry's mind was alive, sharp, and unyielding. He studied the world around him, learning to endure pain in silence, to move quickly without complaint, to hide the fire that burned within. This inner resilience was Henry's secret rebellion. Outwardly, he played the part of the dependable worker, bowing to the demands of a system designed to crush him. But inside, he nurtured a belief that he was more than the chains that bound him, more than the insults hurled at him, more than the labor that defined his days. It was a dangerous conviction, one that could cost him everything if it ever slipped past his lips. Yet it was there, lodged deep in his soul like a stone in the earth, unmoved by the years of toil and torment. Henry learned to carry his rage in silence, to swallow the bitterness of every injustice, to bury his pride where no one could see it. Each strike of the overseer's whip, each mocking word from a passerby, was another weight added to the invisible load he bore. But with every blow, that hidden spark grew stronger, fueled by a truth he held close. He was a man, not a beast, and no amount of cruelty could erase that. As seasons turned into years, Henry's life became a testament to endurance in the face of relentless oppression. The plantation's rhythm ground on, unyielding, but so did the quiet fire within him. He moved through the world with a careful precision, his eyes always watching, his mind always weighing. To those who saw only his labor, he was invisible, a shadow that worked without complaint. But Henry knew better. He knew that his silence was not surrender, it was survival. And in that survival, he held on to something no whip could touch, the belief that one day, somehow, his humanity would demand to be heard. This belief, fragile but unbreakable, was the foundation of the man Henry Johnson would become, a man whose story would one day shatter the silence of a Kentucky night and leave an indelible mark on the hearts of those who heard it. In the dusty lanes of mid-19th century Kentucky, where the air hung heavy with the weight of oppression, Henry Johnson carried more than the physical burdens of slavery. Among the countless indignities he endured, none cut deeper than the relentless cruelty of a white neighbor who lived just close enough to make Henry's life a daily torment. This man was not Henry's master, nor an overseer with any formal authority, but he wielded his power with a vicious delight, turning cruelty into a perverse form of entertainment. His name was a shadow that loomed over Henry's every step, a constant reminder that even in a world already designed to break him, there was always room for more pain. This neighbor's cruelty was not random, it was deliberate, calculated to strip Henry of his dignity, to reduce him to a spectacle for his own amusement. Day after day, their encounters became a ritual of degradation, each one chipping away at the fragile armor Henry had built around his soul. The neighbors' attacks were as varied as they were relentless. On any given morning, as Henry walked the dirt path to the fields, the man would step into his way, a sneer curling his lips. He'd spit near Henry's feet, sometimes directly onto his worn clothes, then laugh as if he told the cleverest joke in Kentucky. The spit wasn't just an act of disrespect, it was a calculated insult, a way to mark Henry as less than human. Words followed, sharp and venomous, twisting Henry's name into something filthy, something to be mocked. "Look at this beast," he'd bellow, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, his voice dripping with contempt. And when words weren't enough, he'd lash out with a stick or a quick, stinging blow across Henry's back, not because Henry had done anything wrong, but simply because he could. To this man, Henry was not a person but a canvas for cruelty, a stage where he could perform his dominance with every strike and jeer. What made these moments unbearable was not just the neighbors' actions, but the way they played out in front of others. The man thrived on an audience, turning Henry's suffering into a public spectacle. In the marketplace or along the road, he'd call out insults that rang through the crowd, each word crafted to humiliate. "Strong as an ox, dumb as dirt," he'd sneer, pointing at Henry as if he were livestock on display. The laughter that followed was a chorus of complicity. Children giggled, mimicking the taunts with sing-song voices, their small hands clapping to the rhythm of Henry's shame. Women passing by hid smirks behind their hands, their pity, if it existed, drowned out by the amusement they shared with the crowd. Even men who might have looked away joined in, their chuckles hammering nails into Henry's heart. Each insult, each laugh, was a wound not to his body but to his dignity, a reminder that in this world, his humanity was a joke to be laughed at. For years, Henry endured this torment with a stoic silence that belied the storm raging within him. He clenched his jaw, forced his body to remain still, and walked away from each encounter, his head bowed to hide the fire in his eyes. Outwardly, he was the picture of submission, a man who absorbed every blow without protest. But inwardly, the humiliation festered like a wound that refused to heal. Every spit, every slap, every mocking word was a drop of poison, pooling in the reservoir of his soul. The neighbors seemed to sense this hidden defiance, and it only fueled his cruelty. He pressed harder, as if determined to break the last shred of Henry's spirit, to grind not just his body but his very essence into dust. His voice became a chain dragged across stone, echoing in Henry's mind even when he sought refuge in the monotony of work. The man's laughter followed him, a constant reminder that freedom was not just denied by the system but mocked by those who lived beside it. The psychological toll of this relentless degradation was profound. Henry's nights were haunted by replays of each encounter, the spit on his boots, the sting of a slap, the crowd's laughter ringing in his ears. He imagined speaking back, seizing the hand that struck him, but fear always pulled him back. He knew the consequences of defiance: a whip slash, a jail cell, or worse, a noose. So he swallowed his rage, year after year, burying it deep where it could not be seen. But silence was no shield. It was a weight that grew heavier with each insult. The neighbor's cruelty became a calendar by which Henry measured his life, each new humiliation marking the passage of time. In the marketplace, the man made Henry his example, calling out taunts that stripped away every trace of humanity. "Beast!" he'd sneer, his voice rising above the bustle of the street, and the laughter that followed was a blade that cut deeper than any whip. Henry became known as the man who never fought back, his silence mistaken for weakness. But silence was not emptiness. It was a reservoir, filling with every jeer, every shove, every mocking word. Some nights, alone under the Kentucky stars, Henry would walk the fields, his eyes searching the heavens for a sign that someone, somewhere, saw him as more than a beast. The weight of those years hollowed him out, but it also sharpened him, like a blade waiting to be drawn. The neighbor's cruelty was not just a personal vendetta. It was a microcosm of the system that bound Henry, a system that thrived on reducing men to shadows. Yet, within Henry, a quiet truth persisted: he was a man, and no amount of humiliation could erase that. Each insult planted a seed of fury, and though he buried it deep, he knew that one day, the reservoir would overflow, and the silence he had carried for so long would break. In the quiet of Kentucky's nights, where the stars flickered faintly through the haze and the world seemed to hold its breath, Henry Johnson carried a storm within him. For years, he had endured the relentless cruelty of a white neighbor whose taunts and blows had carved deep wounds into his dignity. Each insult, each public humiliation, had been met with silence, a silence that the world mistook for weakness. But beneath that stillness, Henry's soul was anything but quiet. As he walked alone under the sprawling oaks, his eyes tracing the faint outlines of constellations, he wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Was he truly the beast they called him? Or was there a man inside, one whose voice had been buried but not extinguished? These moments of silent reflection were Henry's refuge, a space where he could confront the pain of his existence and search for the spark of humanity that no whip could snuff out. Alone with his thoughts, he replayed the neighbor's sneers, the laughter of the crowd, the sting of spit on his boots. Each memory was a weight, but also a sharpening stone, honing the edges of a resolve that was beginning to take shape. Henry's inner world was a battlefield, where rage and restraint waged a constant war. He had learned to bury his anger deep, to let it simmer beneath a mask of obedience that kept him alive. But survival came at a cost. Every time he swallowed an insult, every time he turned away from a blow, a piece of his spirit seemed to wither. Yet, even in this erosion, something new was forming, a quiet strength, a refusal to let his humanity be erased. In the stillness of those solitary nights, Henry began to see his silence not as surrender, but as a shield, a way to protect the fire that burned within him. He wondered if the heavens saw him, if God himself knew his name, or if even the divine had turned away from the suffering of a man in chains. These questions gnawed at him, but they also fueled a growing conviction. He was more than the sum of his suffering, more than the beast the world tried to make him. It was in the shadows, away from the overseer's watchful eyes, that Henry found a fragile sense of community. In hushed gatherings, where enslaved men and women met under the cover of darkness, voices low as if the trees themselves might betray them, Henry began to share his thoughts. These conversations in shadows were dangerous, each word a risk that could bring the lash or worse. Yet, in these stolen moments, Henry found a space to speak truths he had long kept buried. "We're ghosts to them," he whispered one night, his voice steady but heavy with years of pain. "They look right through us. We work, we bleed, and still, we're invisible. They laugh at us as if we're shadows that can't fight back." The words hung in the air, met by a heavy silence. Some nodded, their eyes cast down, afraid to nurture a hope that could not survive the daylight. An older man, his back scarred from decades of labor, shook his head. "Best to keep quiet, Henry," he murmured. "Quiet men live longer." But a young woman, her cheek marked by a faded scar, countered softly. "Quiet men die slower, too." Her words struck Henry like a spark, igniting something he had felt but never named. That night, Henry's silence took on a new weight. It was no longer just a shield to protect him from punishment. It was a choice, a deliberate act of patience. He began to listen differently, to notice the rhythms of the world around him, the tone of the neighbor's jeers, the cadence of the overseer's commands, the moments when cruelty reached its peak. These were no longer just humiliations, they were signals, warnings of a storm that was gathering within him. In the company of others who bore the same chains, Henry spoke less but thought more. His eyes, once fixed on the ground, began to lift, catching the glint of defiance in the gazes of others. Most kept their sparks buried, hidden beneath years of fear and submission. But a few let theirs slip, and in those fleeting glances, Henry saw a shared truth. They were not beasts, not shadows, but men and women whose spirits refused to be fully broken. This growing defiance reshaped Henry's understanding of his own silence. It was no longer a cage but a cloak, one he could cast aside when the moment was right. He began to carry himself differently, his movements still obedient but his mind alert, waiting. The fire within him grew hotter, fed by every insult, every laugh, every act of cruelty that had marked his life. He knew the risks of defiance, whips, chains, or a noose waited for those who dared to step out of line. Yet, the more he endured, the more he realized that silence was not safety. It was another form of bondage. Each day he swallowed his anger, each night he sealed his lips, he was tightening the chains around his own soul. But now, his patience was not resignation, it was strategy. Henry was waiting, watching for the moment when his silence would no longer serve him, when the fire he had nurtured in secret would demand to be seen. In the quiet of those Kentucky nights, Henry Johnson was no longer just a man enduring. He was a man preparing, a man whose defiance was growing, ready to break free. In the heart of a Kentucky Sunday afternoon, where families gathered after church services and the air buzzed with the simple rhythms of rural life, Henry Johnson carried a load of firewood on his shoulder, his steps measured and deliberate. The sun filtered through the leaves of ancient oaks, casting dappled shadows on the dirt road that wound through the community. Women in their finest shawls strolled by, children scampered at the edges, their laughter a stark contrast to the burdens Henry bore. It was in this seemingly ordinary moment that the neighbor, emboldened by the crowd and his own unquenchable malice, chose to escalate his torment to new heights. Stepping deliberately into Henry's path, the man blocked his way with a swagger that spoke of unchallenged power. His voice, sharpened like a blade for the audience, cut through the chatter. "Look at him," he jeered, pointing at Henry as if he were a sideshow attraction in a county fair. "Beast of burden, dumb as a mule, strong arms, but an empty head." The words rang out, drawing eyes from every direction. Laughter erupted from the onlookers, a cruel symphony that swelled with each taunt. Children, innocent in their mimicry, repeated the insults in sing-song voices, clapping their hands to the beat of Henry's degradation. Women smirked behind gloved hands, their feigned pity melting into shared amusement. The neighbor circled Henry like a predator savoring his prey, bending low to spit at his boots, then shoving him with the back of his hand. "Bow lower," he commanded, his tone dripping with contempt. "That's all you're good for." The crowd roared, the humiliation unfolding like a well-rehearsed play, designed to strip Henry bare in front of strangers, friends, and foes alike. For years, Henry had endured such scenes, but this one felt different, raw, unrelenting, a final assault on the tattered remnants of his dignity. Henry froze in place, the weight of the firewood suddenly heavier, not from its bulk, but from the inferno igniting in his chest. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and for the first time in memory, he did not lower his gaze. The neighbor's bravado faltered for a split second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face as he met Henry's eyes. In that glare burned a blaze that no amount of mockery could smother, a storm that had been brewing through endless days of silence and suffering. The laughter of the crowd faded into a distant hum as blood rushed in Henry's ears, his heart pounding like a war drum. He had swallowed this poison for so long, the spits, the slaps, the names that reduced him to nothing. But now, in this public arena, the dam cracked. The neighbor pressed on, oblivious or perhaps defiant, raising his hand for another strike. Henry's fists clenched around the wood, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Imagination gave way to reality. The years of buried rage surged to the surface, a tidal wave that could no longer be held back. This was not just another insult. It was the culmination of a lifetime's worth of degradation, a breaking point where endurance shattered like glass under pressure. In that instant, Henry felt the shift. The quiet man, the one who had always walked away, was gone. What remained was a force of nature, unleashed by the unrelenting cruelty of a system that had pushed him to the edge. That night, under a veil of drifting clouds that obscured the moon, the air turned cool and thick with unspoken tension. Henry was in the yard, chopping wood with the steady rhythm of an axe that had become an extension of his weary arms. Each swing was a release, a momentary escape from the day's echoes. But fate, or perhaps destiny, brought the neighbor stumbling into view, his steps heavy with drink and the arrogance that alcohol amplified. "Still working, beast?" he sneered, stepping closer, his breath reeking of whiskey. "Can't you do anything but sweat and stink?" The words sliced through the quiet, familiar yet freshly venomous. Henry paused, lifting another log onto the stump, his axe raised but unmoving. The neighbor, sensing no immediate threat, grew bolder. He shoved Henry hard in the shoulder, causing the axe to waver mid-air. "Answer me when I talk to you," he barked, his voice rising in fury. Then came the slap, a sharp crack across Henry's face, the sting echoing louder than the blow itself. And with it the laugh, that same mocking cackle Henry had heard for years, the sound that had haunted his dreams and poisoned his days. It was the final thread snapping in a tapestry of torment. Henry's hands tightened around the axe handle, feeling its weight not as a tool, but as an instrument of reckoning. His chest heaved, not with fear, but with a profound release, a catharsis born from depths he had long suppressed. The neighbor stepped forward again, hand raised for yet another strike, but this time, Henry did not yield. The axe rose, swift and unhesitating. A scream pierced the night, raw and desperate, then vanished into an unnatural stillness, swallowed by the darkness as if the earth itself recoiled. The yard fell silent, the only sound Henry's labored breathing, his chest rising and falling like bellows in a forge. The axe hung limp in his hand, a heavy reminder of the line he had crossed. At his feet lay the neighbor, crumpled and lifeless, the laughter silenced forever. For a long, suspended moment, Henry stood motionless, the stars above seeming to dim one by one, as if bearing witness to the gravity of the act. It was not triumph that washed over him, nor relief in the simple sense. Those emotions belonged to men unburdened by chains. Instead, it was something deeper, more primal, the raw acknowledgement that he had answered years of humiliation with finality. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, a defiant proclamation to the heavens that he was no longer the quiet man, the one who bowed and endured. He was the man who had struck back, reclaiming a fragment of his humanity in a world that had sought to erase it. The silence of the yard was not peace, it was the hush before an inevitable storm, a pause pregnant with consequences. Henry looked up at the darkened sky, the clouds drifting like omens, and felt the weight of his defiance settle upon him. There would be no turning back. The act was done, and with it, the fragile veil of his existence had torn. In that moment, under the Kentucky night, Henry Johnson stood tall, not as a victor, but as a man who had dared to say, enough, a single, irreversible act that would ripple through history, a testament to the limits of human endurance and the fierce spark of rebellion that lies within us all. The stillness of that Kentucky night, broken only by the echo of a single scream, gave way to a dawn that carried whispers of a seismic shift. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the news of Henry Johnson's act had spread like wildfire through the dusty lanes and tobacco fields. The man who had lived in silence, enduring years of torment at the hands of a cruel neighbor, had shattered that silence with an axe, leaving the neighbor lifeless in the yard. The community erupted in a storm of emotions, divided sharply along the lines of race and power. Among the white townsfolk, outrage burned hot and fierce. To them, Henry's act was not just murder, it was an affront to the very order that held their world together. A dangerous example. They muttered in churchyards and taverns, their voices thick with fear and indignation. If one enslaved man could strike back, what might others dare to do? The neighbor's body was carried through town on a cart, a grim spectacle meant to underscore the cost of defiance. Women clutched their children, men shook their heads, and whispers of chaos swirled. To them, Henry was no longer just a man, he was a threat, a spark that could ignite rebellion if not snuffed out swiftly. In the shadowed cabins and quiet corners where enslaved people gathered, the story spread differently. Spoken in hushed tones, with wary glances over shoulders, Henry's name became a whisper of awe, a flicker of something dangerous yet inspiring. To some, his act was reckless, a prelude to inevitable reprisal, whips, chains, or worse. But to others, it was a spark of defiance that lit a hidden fire. In a world that demanded submission to survive, Henry had done the unthinkable. He had reclaimed a piece of his dignity, even if just for a moment. He stood up. Some murmured, their voices low but heavy with meaning. He showed them we're not just beasts. The place where the neighbor fell became a kind of silent ground, avoided by those who feared its weight. Some swore they could still hear the echo of that scream, cut short in the night, as if the earth itself remembered. For Henry's people, the story was both a warning and a quiet source of pride, a reminder that even in chains, the human spirit could refuse to be crushed. The white community wasted no time. By dawn, a manhunt was organized with the urgency of a war. Riders saddled horses, their rifles slung across their shoulders, eyes scanning the horizon with grim determination. Dogs strained at their leashes, their barks cutting through the morning mist. The cry went up from farm to farm. Find Henry Johnson. To them, this was not just about capturing one man. It was about restoring a fractured order, proving that defiance would always end in chains or death. Henry, knowing the consequences of his act, had fled into the wilderness. His hands trembled as he gathered a few scraps, a crust of bread, a tattered blanket, a tin cup, and slipped into the dense forests beyond the plantation. His footsteps were heavy but resolute, each one carrying him deeper into a world that offered no promises of safety. The Kentucky woods were unforgiving, their tangled branches clawing at his arms, their roots snagging his bare feet. He followed deer paths, drank from muddy streams, and smeared swamp water on his skin to mask his scent. Every distant bark of a hound jolted his heart, but he pressed on, driven not by hope of escape but by a stubborn refusal to surrender easily. The manhunt was relentless. Riders fanned out in every direction, their boots leaving deep prints in the soft earth. Torches flickered like fiery eyes in the dark, their shouts echoing through the trees. Each broken branch, each footprint in the mud, was a triumph for the hunters, a sign that Henry was close. He moved through thickets where horses couldn't pass, waded silently through swollen rivers, letting the current erase his tracks. Hunger gnawed at his bones, his legs swelled with exhaustion, but he kept moving, one more mile, one more step, one more chance. In those desperate days, some say Henry whispered to himself, not prayers but declarations. I am a man, not a beast. Those words were his fuel, pushing him forward when his body begged to collapse. The forest bore witness to his passage. Mud held the shape of his feet, grass bent under his weight. But the rain, as if conspiring against him, softened the ground, making his trail clearer. The dogs grew louder, the rider's arcs tightened, and the net closed in. Henry's flight ended near a swollen creek, his body too worn to outrun the dogs any longer. They cornered him, their snarls mingling with the shouts of the men who followed. Exhausted, not chained, he was brought down, not by submission, but by the sheer limits of his flesh. Hauled back to town with wrists bound, Henry's eyes remained hollow yet unbroken, carrying a dignity that no rope could strip away. 4 days he had outrun them, defying the world that sought to erase him. As he was dragged through the streets, the white community saw a criminal, a beast to be tamed. But in the eyes of those who shared his chains, there was something else, a man who had dared to stand, even if only for a moment. Henry's capture was not the end of his story but a testament to his defiance, a spark that lingered in the whispers of those who carried his name forward, a reminder that even in the face of relentless pursuit, the human spirit could refuse to bow. The gavel fell like a hammer on Henry Johnson's fate, sealing a story that had already shaken the foundations of a Kentucky town. His trial was no search for truth but a ritual of control, a crowded room filled with white faces glaring with anger and fear. No lawyer stood for Henry. No voice rose in his defense. The charge, murder of a white man, was a verdict in itself, etched in stone before he stepped into the courtroom. When pressed to speak, Henry's words were simple yet piercing. He struck me too many times. He called me less than a man. I am a man. His calm voice silenced the room for a fleeting moment, but the judge's gavel shattered it, and the jury's guilty verdict came swiftly. Death was the sentence, inevitable as the rising sun. Yet, as Henry was led away, his head held a quiet dignity, an armor no rope could pierce. His act of defiance, born from years of humiliation, lived on in whispers among the enslaved. To them, Henry was no criminal but a spark, a man who dared to strike back, proving the human spirit could not be whipped into dust. His unmarked grave faded from history, but his question lingered: what is the greater crime, a desperate act or the system that demanded it? If Henry's story stirs you, subscribe to Murder Files Television on YouTube. Reflect on justice, share your thoughts, and join us to uncover more untold truths.